Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because it is really good to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is the continuation of Baltimore. Okay, here we go. Part 2 of the Jubilee. You know, the Great Jubilee and Exposition Project is underway. There's been a plan formally adopted by the swindlers firm of Hohen, Hook, and Associates, right? And here they go. I'm going to talk a little bit about the meeting that they had, right? And some of the members of the meeting and what went on, right? So there was some debate about what was going on, and the Special Committee of 10, I'll just go over a couple of the names here, the Special Committee of 10 who had been working on this for weeks or months or whatever. Of course, Frank Hohen, the chairman, my favorite name to say, William A. Boykin, J. Harry Trigo, who was president of the Burnt District Commission. We have a Carol, because of course we have a Carol, right? And Edward Hirsch, whose name is going to play a prominent role later on, right? And they have, the meeting was overseen, the directors of the meeting, of course, were the mayor and this congressman and so forth, right? And I want to point out this Bernard N. Baker real quick because his name is going to be important. And so they have the meeting, and you know there's some debate about it. You know, as this guy Jerome H. Joyce, he says that the committee is, you know, that the report that they put forth is too broad and sweeping and not good enough. But Mr. Carroll says that although Mr. Joyce has a point, right, his motion is not debatable. He hoped it would be voted down, you know, and it was. But as they move forward, they talk about expanding the committee, which also, you know, meets some opposition, right? And because there's claims by this Mr. Rowland guy, who's well represented at this meeting, by the way, as I'll show in a minute, of the committee procrastinating, and Mr. Hohen here, he takes objection. I object to the word procrastination. You have no right to use it here. And so Mr. Rowland politely, I withdraw the word if it is objectionable, right? But they go on to say, and Mr. Joyce says that he thinks that a larger committee is a good idea because he would like young men who will take off their coats and hustle, right, to work along the older men to balance and correct us when we make mistakes, you know. And so there's a bunch of new names suggested, and you know, they want to, the first motion was to go to 25, but it goes down to 10, and this is when they start to do their fundraising, right? And right away, Mr. Carroll says that he pointed out that the promises to purchase stock in a company before it had received its charter were not binding, and he and others thought it advisable to wait until the corporation had been legally born. And I like legally born, of course, because when you incorporate, you have the rights of a citizen, right? That's how they're protecting themselves, and that's was the first order of business, was to read the report and recommend that they incorporate, you know, to eliminate the possibility of any personal liability, right? So the corporation is yet to be born, right? The Greater Baltimore Jubilee and Exposition Association, because they really want this to happen, this exposition. They really want that. So Mr. Carroll decides he's not gonna buy the stock, but I just want to go over who he was real quick, right? And so he comes from the Anna Arundel line of Carrolls, which is the signer, Charles Carroll the signer, and Charles Carroll of Annapolis and so forth. And he owns mills and manufacturing plants, and his main mill is the Whitehall Mill, which becomes the Clipper Mill. And he owns it with this gentleman, Horatio N. Gambrel. But one of the things I wanted to point out is I believe that there's a whole lot of nepotism in these things. So just to point that out, his daughter one of Carroll's daughters marries John Timanus, who's a owner of the Timanus Mill, which of course the mayor is also part owner of. So marrying into the family there, right? And the Horatio Gambrel, whose name is not mentioned in any of those early meetings, his daughter marries Richard W. Hook, who I have to believe is a relative of our Colonel Jacob Hook, right? Keeping everything close to the vest, right? And yeah, so Carroll declines, but Mr. Hohen says, you know, we're all friends here. Let's get the ball rolling. Let's make a good show for the people. All right, and so they start selling these stock options before the corporation is born, right? And it's interesting that they all brag to each other, you know, like I'll bet I can get my blank and a blank is just like a sheet, it's like your fundraising sheet, like they send home in school, your list of subscribers and how much they donated, right? He can get his filled within 3 days. This other guy says he can get 12 names for $1,000 during dinner hour tomorrow. He can raise 28 grand for dinner tomorrow night. This other guy has a scheme, right? And it's to get all his friends to subscribe, and then he will equal that. He'll match all his friends, the total of his friends' subscriptions. And so I wanted to look at the list of subscribers and see who are the biggest ones, right? Who are the biggest subscribers, right? And first I noticed Roland here, who is the one who really wanted to expand the committee to like 25. He's well represented. And between him and his family, he buys 100 stocks, which is $2,800, right off the bat, right? But the two biggest ones, interestingly enough, are this Jerome H. Joyce, who puts forth at the beginning of the meeting that he doesn't think that the special committee of 10 has done a very good job, right? But he puts down $1,000 for 100 shares, and that's like $28,000 today, all right? And so who is he? And it says here that he was president of the Aero Club of Baltimore and owner of the Joyce Hotel. Now, I think that's really interesting, Aero Club. Now, I didn't go looking this up yet or anything, but I have to believe that he's going to be a player in the early aeronautic industry. And we all know where that's going to lead, I think, right? So he has the potential to be a very interesting person, right? A quick search didn't really bring up much other than this. So I'm going to have to go digging for him. And the next, of course, was this B.N. Baker, this Bernard Baker, who was part of the directors for the meeting, not part of the committee itself, but directing the meeting, right? And he puts forth $2,000 or, darn close to 60 grand before there's even a charter he puts down, right? So who is this guy? And this guy, right, he's descended from generations of wealthy Baltimore merchants and glass manufacturers. Right, he studied in Philadelphia with noted geologist and chemist Frederick Genth, and I think his name came up in the Philadelphia episode, the road trip. I'm going to probably get into him at some point. Right, he was a special student at Yale College. Special, isn't that special? And although he founded 3 businesses supplying coal, tugs, and lighters and cold storage facilities in Baltimore Harbor, right? Even though the mercantile marine business had been declining, right, in the face of British competition. But it's his dream to own a transatlantic steamship. And so with the support of the Pennsylvania Railroad, not the B&O Railroad, interestingly, right, in 1881, that year again, same thing backwards and forwards, Baker establishes the Atlantic Transport Line, right, which is a massive shipping company which ships freight and livestock from Baltimore and Philadelphia over to England and ports beyond, I have to believe. But in 1892, he initiates the exclusively first-class direct London to New York passenger service, for which the ATL becomes famous, right? And so he ends up wanting to sell this in the late 1890s to his British competitors, right? Which leads to the creation of J. Pierpont Morgan's colossal International Mercantile Marine Company, which of course is responsible for the Titanic. So I think it's amazing that even indirectly I can tie the Titanic to Baltimore, right? Because would this International Mercantile Marine Company be possible without the Atlantic Transport Line being there first? And so eventually I guess I'm going to be doing an episode on the Titanic down the line, right? So it's very interesting that these are the people who are really pushing for this exposition and the Baltimore Jubilee, all right? And this was on February 21st, right? But not all is well, all right? On April 6th, 1906, the Baltimore Sun, and this editorial goes without a signature, so it's just basically from the editors of the Sun, I guess, right? They essentially say that they don't believe that the city is ready, and that they believe that to have a proper fare, like the one that was done in St. Louis and Buffalo, right, wouldn't be good for the space that they want to put it at, which is down by the market, right? And they say it would not be pleasant or advantageous to have our visitors go away and call our show the Marsh Market Exposition, right? And they would call it the Baltimore Exposure, because he believes that there are many ways of advertising a city, but throwing an exposition that is equivalent to essentially a county fair, which is what he says here, would make Baltimore a laughingstock, and they would be charged with false pretenses by the thousands beguiled here. They don't feel that, having an exposition like this is good for Baltimore at all, and that they should focus on smaller things, right? There's Baltimore's good name as well as its business interests are at stake in the matter. And in point of fact, Baltimore is more of a working place, more of a beehive and than a show or peacock town. Like more than a beehive, like this beehive on my arches, or perhaps they meant this kind of beehive, which is on the masthead for the Baltimore Sun. Interesting that the Baltimore Sun editorial would mention beehives when it has beehives in its masthead, right? And this masthead is really interesting. I'm going to go over it in a little bit of detail right now, just quickly to point out some things, because when I was looking for, when they were first announcing the dates for this, and Mr. Gaither says that he thinks it should be in September to line up with the Jubilee that's already in place. And so I was like, well, what happened 50 years ago? And so I went looking, and I found the masthead from 50 years ago is this, which also has a beehive on it, by the way. And there are many astonishing differences from the masthead from 1856 to the masthead on the Sun, a light for all, in 1906. So let's just point out some of the differences real quick, because it's kind of fun and interesting, right? In 1856, right, we have this steamship off here, right? And the mountains behind, right? The hills, the rolling hills of Maryland, right? And our beehive. And we've got a ship being built back here. The artist's palette is here, as is the sickle and the anchor, right? We have what could be maybe a hatchet or hammer or something here, right? And Our Lady is sitting here, postured to her left and looking left. The scale of justice raised high. Right, she's holding like a sword or a staff or something, and the eagle also is looking off to his left, right? And in the background here, we have all kinds of spires, all kinds of towers and stuff happening back here, right? We have bundles. Maybe I'm guessing these could be tobacco bundles, right? And there's the train, of course, for the B&O Railroad, right? When you look at the changes that were made over the course of 50 years, right? They've doubled the beehive. Doubled it, right? Here's that ship they were building, and to me this is more reminiscent maybe of building of the Ark, and not so much the Ark and Dove of the Calverts, but perhaps maybe Noah's Ark, and going back to Gambrinus and that, right? The artist's palette is still here. Again, really crucial that they have this connection to the arts. All right, that was on the side of the Hohen building, of course, and it's very important to these industrialists. Right, we have now like a bale of wheat or something harvested with the sickle. All right, and the anchor's here, and there's our bale of perhaps tobacco. But now the eagle is going off to the right, and she's postured off to the right, yet continuing to look left. And the scales of justice are now down below, hanging from a limp wrist. Right, and her sword or staff or whatever is now concealed behind her. This way, I think some really interesting changes in the masthead, right? Especially with the beehive reference and all the beehive symbology that's synchronicitous with Baltimore. But the commission is undaunted by this, although they do decide that perhaps, yes, maybe a full-blown exposition is not a good idea. And so here they reduce the amount. They say that now $100,000 is desired. But they believe that a credible celebration can be arranged for $50,000. So going from close to 3 million to close to $1.5 million, right? And so The idea of holding an exposition in connection with a Jubilee has been abandoned, but the Travelers and Merchants Association, of which Carroll was president of which Jacob Hook was president of at some point. I don't know how often they have their elections and so forth, but they decide they're going to have a home products exposition in Baltimore instead, right? So they're going to do that. They're moving forward, but it's interesting that they don't say, they say that this amount is desired, but they don't say anything about the other amount. Like they're reducing it. That other amount is still out there, by the way. But so now they move forward, and this is the Jubilee is on, and the home product exposition is on, and here we go. We're arriving now to the Sunday paper for the Jubilee. All right, and I think that's going to be the end of part 2. All right, and I'm going to pick up with part 3 tomorrow. All right, we'll see how I did with this one. Like I said, it's a very dense story, and I don't want to put too much in any one episode. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one. It's going to get crazier. And so until the next one, cheers, guys.